It was one of the most brutal murders that I've ever seen or heard of, and it was clearly a murder that was intended for him to suffer.
The body had been on fire. He was alive when he was set on fire.
They wanted to torture him.
We were both being charged with open murder and conspiracy to kill murder.
This was premeditated, cold-hearted, just evil.
He spoke to me about him like, my girlfriend is afraid of her ex-boyfriend. And if he doesn't stop, I'm gonna have to get involved.
You don't have to kill somebody to make them leave you alone, okay?
She had become upset, distraught, and we came up with this stupid idea.
He felt like he was keeping her safe.
She could have made this whole thing up to get you all stirred up.
It was clear that she was simply a master manipulator.
He found this golden ticket with her, and he had to do whatever she wanted him to do to obtain that. You took these two people together, and it just turned into pure evil.
November 14th, 2009, South Haven, Michigan. It's just after noon when authorities receive a 911 call from a concerned resident about a car fire in a forest clearing.
He lived in the area outside of town, very close to Lake Michigan, but a little bit outside of the city. It was a pretty rural area.
He came across a car that was burned out and called 911.
South Haven Fire and Police Departments quickly respond to the scene.
You could see the car smoldering from the road. It had been stuck in the mud. The car was not too far off the main road, and it was burned completely.
At first, they're just trying to piece it together to find out what happened here. Was it someone that intentionally torched their car for insurance purposes, or was it something more nefarious?
The fire investigators for South Haven Fire began to walk around the area to see if they could discover any evidence of a crime. One of the fire investigators, approximately 100 yards from the vehicle, came across a burned body underneath a tree. At that point, they then contacted our central dispatch. So once I received the call that we had a body, all detectives came out to the scene to work this case.
The body had been duct taped around the head and mouth. The arms had been duct taped behind the back, and there was a large amount of duct tape around the thighs of the individual.
It was one of the most brutal murders that I've ever seen or heard of, and it was clearly a murder that was intended for them to suffer.
And as we stood there, we had more questions than we had answers. We had no idea what had occurred here.
So we had to first discover who our victim was, and then from there work our way out.
The car that was burned was totally unidentifiable, but there was a license plate in the VIN that was also intact.
The registered owner was Brandon Silverlight, and that's when we started backtracking, trying to find out where he was or if this was the deceased.
Authorities head to Brandon's registered address, where they're met by his wife, Jennifer.
We told her that we had a burned car, and we were trying to find out or ascertain where Brandon might be.
We found out that Brandon was missing from the night before and had not returned. It was not returning any of her phone calls or text messages.
We start with, when's the last time you saw him? Did he leave the home? What was his plans for the evening? What were you told by him? And that was the opening of our discussion.
Born in Michigan in 1984, Brandon Silverlight grew up in South Haven.
Brandon came from a good home. He had good parents, a good life. My first impression of Brandon was he was just a goofy guy, and he was very personable. He could just be silly with us, and he was always very nice to people.
After graduating high school in 2003, Brandon enrolled in Western Michigan's School of Music.
Brandon was very musical. His family was also musically inclined. He had scholarships lined up. He was going to be a music teacher.
On nights and weekends, Brandon played gigs around town with a local band.
My relationship with Brandon was bandmate. We met him at a party where we were playing, and he ended up just joining pretty much on the spot. He was a very good drummer, and he was also very good on bass.
According to Jennifer, a shared love of music was what attracted her to Brandon in 2001.
She was involved with the Western Michigan University Marching Band. At one point, Brandon was, so I believe that is the common denominator for them was music.
Jennifer was an attractive woman and a very self-assured and strong-minded woman.
The couple dated for 7 years. In February 2008, they married in Lake Buena Vista, Florida.
They had been together for several years before marrying, and so there was a well-established partnership.
He had a good life, and he had the whole world in front of him.
Nearly 2 years into their marriage, Brandon's car has been found torched by the side of a rural road, and unidentified remains point to a homicide.
Jennifer really didn't know what to think of it at that point.
She had explained that he had left the night before to play video games and had not returned.
She indicated that he was going to a LAN party. It was like a group of people getting together at a location and playing one of these online games. And he left around 10 o'clock in the evening or so.
When it got later on in the night, she had texted, and his reply was very short, and his phone was then turned off.
The phone calls went to voicemail, texts were left unanswered.
Jennifer indicated that it wasn't uncommon for Brandon to go gaming with friends, but it was unusual for him to be out all night the way that he was on this night.
Jennifer says instead of letting her worries get the best of her, she convinced herself that maybe Brandon didn't come home for another reason.
Jennifer indicated at one point that they did have an open relationship.
Following their conversation with Jennifer, investigators attend the autopsy.
The victim was taken to Sparrow Hospital in Lansing, where the autopsy was performed.
Because of the condition of the body, dental records had to be used to identify the deceased, and the deceased was identified as Brandon Silverlight.
So they need to go in and find out more and do some digging into the background. Who would have wanted to do something like this? Who were his enemies?
Coming up, the discovery of a bitter rejection will lead authorities to a scorned lover wrought with obsession.
He had filed a stalking complaint against her. My own theory is that it was, well, if I can't have him, no one else will have him either.
She had to have fed him some horrible lies so he would retaliate.
On November 14th, 2009, South Haven, Michigan authorities are investigating the brutal murder of Brandon Silverlight.
From the autopsy, we learned that the victim had received several stab wounds throughout his body. He also had a laceration across the neck and had some blunt force trauma to his head area.
The body had been on fire. The autopsy indicated the presence of elevated levels of carbon monoxide in the lungs. He was alive when he was set on fire.
It looked like someone had drugged Brandon about 100 yards underneath a tree, tortured him, stabbed him several times, and then that's when they set him on fire. It was definitely a hateful homicide, I would say. The person that was involved in this was definitely out to hurt this person and make them suffer. You begin from the inside and work your way to the outside, because usually the closest people are either involved in a crime like this or they have information on who might have done it.
Following the autopsy, investigators must break the tragic news to Brandon's wife, Jennifer.
When we informed her that Brandon was deceased, she was very distraught.
She was in shock and she was very upset.
Investigators asked Jennifer about the state of her marriage to Brandon and whether it led to any issues.
They'd had some rocky patches, but they had weathered them as young couples do. She said she had recently become pregnant and that they were looking to start a family.
Their marriage had grown closer as she had found out she was pregnant. So things were settling down. Maybe not as open a relationship as they had agreed to initially.
Brandon's wife seemed very concerned and truthful.
Because he had not come home, she had done some of her own, for a better term, investigating. The phone that Brandon had was a family account. She could access this, and she was able to access the numbers that had been called from early in the afternoon of the 13th, all the way up until Brandon didn't appear to respond to the phone anymore. There was approximately 16 entries. We have no narrative, we just have the date and the time, who initiated, who received. Jennifer stated that one of the phone numbers that was repeatedly contacted, she believed to be an Allison Martin's phone number.
Allison had been in Brandon's life his girlfriend before he married Jennifer.
Investigators wrap up their interview with Jennifer and reach out to 22-year-old Allison Martin, who lives an hour away in Kalamazoo.
Detective O'Reilly and I had made contact, and we conducted a voluntary interview.
We did ask her some very general questions, did not get into any accusatory type of questions at that point. We were just gaining background information at that point.
So Allison grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Her parents were, I would say, wealthy. She lived a privileged life.
It appears that she had opportunities, that she had graduated high school from a good school here in the area.
Allison had a job at one point at a animal kennel, but she just had odd jobs, nothing, no career set or anything like that.
Investigators shift their line of questioning to her past with Brandon.
She provided details of her dating and her relationship with Brandon.
Investigators learn that Allison met Brandon when she was 16 years old.
They had met while Brandon was working part-time at a guitar shop, and Allison would show up at his work.
They dated for some time, but it didn't work out for various reasons.
She claimed that she was over him and she had moved on.
We kind of go through the dating history. She gave us a former boyfriend, 2 former boyfriends, and then she said she was currently engaged to Justin Terpstra.
When was the last time that you actually physically saw Brandon?
It's almost been a year now.
Okay. All right. Have you talked to him or had any communication via phone, internet, email, text, or anything?
I can't remember.
We knew she had had recent contact with Brandon, so that is an indicator that she's not being truthful.
Following Allison's statement, investigators subpoena the data from both her and Brandon's cell phones and discover Allison and Brandon had been communicating frequently for the past week.
So what the search warrant showed was in the evening hours of the 13th, there was repeated texting contact between Brandon Silverlight's phone and Allison Martin's phone.
Allison saying, come on, let's meet. I have this other woman. Let's get together, have some fun. Let's have sex. Let's have a three-way.
Brandon said, okay. There was discussions about a rendezvous at a cousin's at the restaurant in South Haven. Another text, okay, we'll meet at cousin's and then follow you to the trailer.
Investigators discover that on November 13th, Allison and Brandon sent messages confirming their plans.
That was the narrative of the text back and forth. Can't wait to see you tonight type conversations.
Allison Martin, in her first interview with police, said she hadn't seen Brandon in over a year. In an investigation such as this, when we find clear evidence that someone is lying, that's a strong indication they're trying to cover something else up.
In the days following the brutal murder of 24-year-old Brandon Silverlight, investigators in South Haven, Michigan, have discovered that he made plans to meet his ex-girlfriend, 22-year-old Allison Martin, on the night he disappeared.
At this point, we decide that we're going to go confront Allison.
Hey, Allison, how are you? Can we talk to you for a couple minutes?
Yeah.
We wanted to go back over a couple other things with you, and I got a little confused when we talked the other night, and I had asked you when the last time you'd actually seen him, and then the last time you had any kind of contact with him whatsoever.
I can't remember. I really can't tell you.
At which point, Detective O'Reilly confronted her with the fact that we had the site towers, that her phone was in South Haven, she was in South Haven, and that we had the narrative in text. She flew into a rage.
You can't do that. That's an invasion of privacy.
We have search warrants. We have court orders.
I want a lawyer. I don't want to talk to you anymore. I want a lawyer.
You know what, Allison? Quite honestly, you need a lawyer, and you better get a very good one. Thank you for your time.
With Allison no longer willing to talk, investigators turn to the person closest to her.
The next step that we do is research on her fiancé, Justin Terpstra. We want to gather some intel about Justin Terpstra before we choose to interview him.
Investigators learn 24-year-old Justin was born in Michigan and raised by his father.
My older brother Justin was the third of 4 children. There are 3 boys and 1 girl. We weren't necessarily a poor family, but we weren't wealthy either. We were kind of wild youngins, kind of left to our own devices.
Justin, I mean, he was a happy kid. He was very mischievous.
He was a jokester. He was a clown. He wanted attention, but if he couldn't get it in a positive way, he would resort to negative ways. He was a bad boy. He was drinking, smoking. He had been in and out of different juvenile detention centers. He would get in trouble for stealing, and then while he is serving detention or whatever for that, he would go and steal something else.
Me and Justin grew up together, and he would just somehow manage to get himself in that little bit of trouble enough to get himself thrown back into juvie. And then when he got out and we turned 18, we stayed in contact, but that's when he was having his issues with going back to prison.
Justin was convicted of home invasion.
After being released on parole in June of 2009, 24-year-old Justin got a job at a local restaurant and began taking classes at a local community college.
He seemed like he was ready to start being a man and doing what it took to move forward in life.
I think he just wanted to be a functional, normal civilian that contributes to society.
He was doing everything he needed to do to pursue a better life, and I was happy for him for that. And then he met Allison.
Their meet cute was at the Crow's Nest, which was a coffee shop across the street from the house he was living at. He had a mutual friend that introduced them. He literally only knew her for like a week before he moved in with her.
Allison seemed like a good fit for him because she wanted him to succeed and would be stern with him with the, I don't want you drinking, you need to go to work. And I think he liked that because he has always needed that.
After collecting background information, investigators tracked Justin down.
We knew that Terpstra is on parole. We would contact the parole office and inform them of what we're working on. It turns out that Terpstra had reported his parole officer, but failed to comply with part of his parole. And they subsequently picked him up on a parole violation and lodged him in the Kalamazoo County Jail.
Investigators travel to the jail to interview Justin, where he has been housed for the past few hours.
Well, I'd shake your hand, but since you're handcuffed, then I'm Detective O'Reilly, Detective Mathis with the Allegheny County Sheriff's Department. I'm going to be straight up forward with you, okay? There was a homicide over the weekend, okay, just north of South Haven, and we've already talked to Allison. The person is deceased is her ex-boyfriend. Do you know Brandon Silverlight? No, the only Brandon I know is my brother.
He said he didn't know Brandon, had never met him, and really knew very, very little about him.
And the status of your relationship is you're engaged? Yes. We're actually planning on getting our marriage license pretty soon. You're not involved? No. You got a good girl that you think loves you, and then you find out that maybe she does love you, but she may have feelings for somebody else. It's logical to think that. Another logical thing could be that she takes off, you're not really sure where she's going, so you follow her and catch her in the act. Maybe you went to kick his ass or something, and things got out of hand, correct? In my mind, it just seems so out the wall ridiculous.
According to Justin, he was at Allison's home in Kalamazoo on the night of the murder.
We have not done your cell phone yet. We're going to do your cell phone. If you're lying to us, you're going to go to prison for the rest of your life. That's simple, okay?
As the interview continues, investigators notice Justin has some injuries on his arm.
Okay, what you got over here? Burns here. Those are burns? Did you report that at all? Well, I mean, it was a grease burn from the fryers. You go back to your cell, go back to your bunk, and you rest well.
The fact that he was burned was clearly suspicious and more than likely indicated that he had in fact been involved with the murder of Brandon Silverlight.
Coming up, stories begin to shift as a betrayal comes to light.
Basically, she said something along the lines that, doesn't it hurt when someone else has control over you?
I really think he felt like he was keeping her safe.
In their preliminary interviews with police, Allison Martin and her fiancé, Justin Terpstra, both denied any knowledge of the murder of Brandon Silverlight. But investigators know Allison is lying, and they strongly suspect Justin is too.
Those are burns?
Nothing burns I got from working.
Fire burns? 2.
Justin had claimed that he wasn't in South Haven the night of the murder, so investigators file a subpoena for his phone location records. In the meantime, they re-examine the messages between Allison and Brandon.
We knew in the evening hours of the 13th, there was repeated texting contact between Brandon Silverlight's phone and Allison Martin's phone. There was discussions about a rendezvous at a restaurant in South Haven. And then I will follow you to the trailer.
It was discovered that Allison's parents owned a summer trailer. It's a gated area.
The trailer that Martin's owned was less than a half a mile from the burnt card and the body recovery. My raw reaction was, holy crap, we gotta go there right now.
With a search warrant at the trailer, we did enter the trailer, and there was no indication that there was any type of scuffle in the trailer.
But the steps to the mobile home were askew. Rocks had been displaced. Something happened there.
There was also a piece of duct tape that was folded on itself that was laying on the ground on the concrete.
The duct tape was significant because that's how Brandon was bound at the scene.
That's where we thought the initial attack or assault on Brandon occurred.
Detectives return to the station and get the proof they need when they receive the location records for Justin's phone.
Both Justin Terpstra and Allison Martin's phones were in South Haven on the early AM hours of the 14th.
Armed with evidence that Justin had lied to investigators, they bring him in for a second interview.
Justin was confronted with the evidence that put him near the scene.
They talked to him again and again, and eventually he did confess that, in fact, he is the one that killed Brandon Silverlight.
I stabbed him several times.
He said, I did it. Allison had nothing to do with it.
Following Justin's confession, authorities charge him with murder.
It was a shock to me. I mean, I can see Justin stealing. I can see him pulling crimes, but to actually haul off and murder someone was not something I ever thought him capable of.
My jaw hit the floor, and there was no way. You know, I had known Justin my whole life. He was not a violent person like that.
As investigators continue building their case against Justin, they reach out to his family, who explained that Justin had previously mentioned his dislike for Brandon Silverlight.
Justin was talking about Brandon, Allison's ex-boyfriend, and how he keeps contacting her and harassing her. Justin felt that Brandon was a threat to Allison from what she said and how she said it. That's how Justin spoke to me about him. Like, my girlfriend is afraid of her ex-boyfriend, and if he doesn't stop, I'm gonna have to get involved.
Following their conversations with Justin's loved ones, authorities attempt to corroborate Justin's claims that Brandon harassed Allison.
There was nothing ever reported by Martin regarding Silverlight stalking her or harassing her or abusing her.
In fact, Brandon had filed a stalking complaint against Allison in, I believe, 2007 with the Kalamazoo Department of Public Safety. Brandon had indicated that she was engaging in unwanted phone calls to him, and I believe came to his residence uninvited. And so the police actually investigated and did interview Allison Martin, and she admitted to the police that she was in fact obsessed with Brandon Silverlight. Brandon was her first love, and that she had boyfriends after that, but their relationship would rekindle from time to time. So Brandon meant a lot to her.
We knew Allison was lying and not being fully truthful with Justin.
At that point, the law enforcement team believed the motive for this crime was based on Allison Martin, on her not being able to have Brandon the way she wanted. And if she couldn't, no one would.
In Allegan County, Michigan, authorities have charged Justin Terpstra with the murder of Brandon Silverlight. But they believe his fiancée, Allison Martin, played a larger role than he admitted.
Allison Martin still was maintaining she was not the responsible party for this, so they needed more evidence.
Then, 20 days into the case, a local resident named Sean West contacts investigators with damning information about Allison.
Sean West was a friend of Terpstra's and Martin's.
Sean West said that during Thanksgiving dinner, he asked Allison what happened because he was hearing things and he knew that Allison and Brandon had been an item.
Sean West said that Allison confessed to him.
And she told him, I stabbed him first.
She wanted him to experience pain, and she had made a reference to that it felt like stabbing chicken. Justin had been arrested, and Allison Martin had told Sean West to relay a message to Justin Terpstra to take the fall if he talked to him again. So that was very key information.
Investigators immediately issue a warrant for Allison Martin's arrest. On December 7th, she turns herself in.
Her attorney contacted the prosecutor's office, but she didn't make any statements to us.
Without Allison's cooperation, investigators interview Justin for a third time, hopeful that he'll flip on his fiancée.
So she has been charged.
She's been charged.
What has she been charged with?
She's been charged with open murder and conspiracy to commit murder. We need to know Allison's participation. We know, there's no doubt, with the text and the other things that have gone on, that she helped you plan this. Bottom line is, it's all premeditated. She participated in luring him there.
Allison Martin had invited or promised Brandon Silverlight a sexual three-way with herself and another unnamed girl.
So let's talk about the text. Those came from Allison, right?
Yes.
Thank you. And in regards to the plan and the setup, she was doing all that texting?
She was doing the texting on my influence.
Justin said that he forced Allison to help him commit that crime. He basically was going to take the fall for Allison. They were lying to us.
You didn't threaten her. You did not intimidate her. She acted of her own free will, didn't she? Because she was mad. She was upset.
Justin continues to claim that Allison feared Brandon's harassment and makes another shocking allegation.
Justin said that Allison had claimed that Brandon had sexually assaulted her.
And we talk about our past, so that we can try to avoid bringing that into our relationship. This is that, the guy that I told you about. I told her basically ignore it or tell him, buzz off, whatever. But they continue talking.
Allison and Brandon did have communication with each other, even after he filed the stalking report.
She had become upset, distraught,
You don't have to kill somebody to make them leave you alone, okay?
In his mind, Brandon was very bad towards Allison in their relationship, and that he believed Brandon was trying to get back in a relationship with Allison. I believe that she was using this story to get what she wanted. Allison was looking for someone to kill Brandon because she could not have him anymore.
She was stalking him. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that.
So she could have made this whole thing up to get you all stirred up, mad, angry, enough to help her carry out something.
I don't believe she would do that.
Could it be that she thinks that Brandon's happy and Brandon now is having a child and that she was just jealous of that whole entire situation?
There's more to it than that.
Is it? Okay.
Under intense pressure, Justin slowly begins to crack.
I'm upset because this guy, who I don't think too highly of, is contacting the girl, and we came up with this stupid idea.
Eventually, he did tell the police that she was involved as well. I think that once he realized that she had lied, he blamed her.
She's not walking away from this.
In his pre-arraignment interview on December 8, 2009, Justin Terpstra has implicated his fiancée, Allison Martin, in the plot to murder her ex-boyfriend, Brandon Silverlight.
Justin said that they tried to lure him to the Kalamazoo area prior to the South Haven area, and it never worked out.
And then it developed into this potential for a hookup involving a threesome.
And this was the bait to get him there. I don't know his mindset, but it appeared to spark his interest.
What time did this happen?
He was to meet her around 11 o'clock.
Allison had dropped off Justin to the trailer prior to her meeting Brandon at the restaurant. At that point, Brandon had followed Allison to the trailer.
Justin explains that when Allison and Brandon arrived at her parents' trailer for the threesome, he was waiting.
Justin Terpstra hit him in the head, I believe knocking him out.
They then duct taped him around his legs and ankles, and then were able to drag him to his vehicle and bring him to the crime scene.
They got him out, duct taped him to a tree.
I can't recall whether she's standing first or I standing first.
But you know she stabbed him twice.
She stabbed him twice. Basically, she said something along the lines that, doesn't it hurt when someone else has control over you?
They both wanted Brandon to die, but they wanted to torture him before they ultimately killed him.
I stabbed him a lot. I don't know. How many times? 20, 30 times. I don't know.
They ultimately set him on fire and kill him. They tried to cover up the crime by burning his car. This was premeditated, cold-hearted, just evil.
The motive was Allison's revenge. She was obsessed with Brandon Silverlight.
She was upset that he had found another person. My own theory is that it was, well, if I can't have him, no one else will have him either.
It was probably one of the most heinous, just most disregard for human life that I've ever seen in my 30 years.
It's just, it's almost too cruel to think about. I absolutely feel bad for his family having to go through this. Nobody deserves this.
Allison Martin and Justin Terpstra are tried separately in the fall of 2010. At Allison's trial, prosecutors present evidence that Brandon's ex remained fixated on him after their breakup.
She had no prior criminal history, but she did have a history of numerous boyfriends and unusual behavior, obsessive type behavior.
She tried to manipulate prior boyfriends into beating up Brandon, but that didn't work because they didn't believe the lies that she told. Unfortunately, Justin Terpstra did.
I believe that she had to have fed him some horrible lies to make him believe that Brandon would have done horrible things to her, so he would retaliate.
I really think he believed that Brandon was a very bad person. He felt like he was keeping her safe.
It was clear that Allison Martin, I don't know how else to say it, is simply a master manipulator.
During their trials, they both pointed the finger at each other. You know, Justin's attorney argued that it was all Allison. Allison and her attorney argued that it was all Justin.
The evidence was very clear that Justin and Allison lured Brandon to that remote location with the specific intent to murder him.
Both were convicted of murder one, which in the state of Michigan is automatic life in prison with no chance of parole.
I don't know that Brandon's family ever had a sense of closure, not when the perpetrators were arrested, not when they were convicted, not when they were sentenced. Because I think for Brandon's family, for them, this is a life sentence.
It broke my heart to have a brother who could do something like that. It does make me sad, but at the same time, you made your bed. So he needs to lie in it.
I think Allison manipulated Justin, and Justin, coming from a broken home, found this golden ticket with Allison and her family, and he had to do whatever she wanted him to do to obtain that. You took these two people together and it just turned into pure evil.
Brandon didn't deserve anything like this. He should still be here with his family, watching his child grow up.
It's tragic for his family, for his wife, and for everybody that knew him.
A walk that should have been safe, there are moments in life that feel so ordinary, so routine, that they pass without a second thought. Moments that exist quietly within the rhythm of daily living, where nothing appears out of place and nothing suggests that anything could go wrong. And it is within these moments that a sense of safety is formed, not because danger has been carefully evaluated and dismissed, but because it has never presented itself in a way that demands attention. And for Jill Marr, one such moment began on a night in 2012 in Melbourne, a city known for its activity, its movement, and its sense of normalcy, where people move through streets, through neighborhoods, through the spaces that connect one part of their lives to another, often without hesitation, often without fear. And on that night, nothing about her actions stood apart from this pattern. Nothing suggested that she was stepping into a situation that would later be examined, analyzed, and remembered far beyond the boundaries of that single evening. Because what she did was something countless others had done before and would continue to do after. She walked home. And it is precisely this simplicity, this absence of anything unusual, that gives the case its enduring weight, because it forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality. That danger does not always announce itself, that it does not always exist in places that are clearly marked or easily avoided, but can instead emerge within the very routines that are assumed to be safe. And as she moved through the urban environment of Melbourne, there were no visible signs of threat, no indication that the space she occupied had shifted from ordinary to dangerous. And yet, within that same space, within that same sequence of movement, something changed. Something occurred that would transform a routine walk into a moment of irreversible consequence. And this transformation did not unfold gradually. It did not build in a way that allowed for recognition or response, but instead occurred with a suddenness that defines many acts of violence, where the transition from safety to danger is not perceived until it has already taken place. And it is this suddenness that complicates understanding, because it leaves behind a sequence that is difficult to fully process. A sequence where cause and effect exist in close proximity, where the time between them is so brief that it resists detailed reconstruction. And in the absence of that reconstruction, what remains is a stark contrast, a before and an after, separated by an event that was neither expected nor preventable within the framework of what was known at the time. And as the case would later reveal, This was not a situation shaped by long-term risk or escalating warning signs, but by an encounter, a moment in which one individual approached another, and in that moment, the assumptions that had defined the environment, the assumptions of safety, of normalcy, of predictability, were abruptly replaced by something else entirely. Something that did not align with those assumptions and could not be anticipated by them. And this is where the story begins, not with a clear indication of danger, but with its absence. Not with a deviation from routine, but with the continuation of it. Because it is within that continuation that the true impact of the case is found. The realization that what is familiar is not always safe. That what is routine is not always protected from disruption. And that the spaces people move through every day, the streets, the paths, the routes that connect one place to another, can become the setting for events that are as unexpected as they are irreversible. And in understanding this, the case of Jill Maher does not begin with the act of violence itself, but with the quiet normalcy that preceded it. Because it is that normalcy that defines what was lost, not only in terms of outcome, but in terms of expectation, the expectation that an ordinary action, carried out in an ordinary place, would lead to an ordinary conclusion, an expectation that, on that night, was not fulfilled. The ordinary life behind the name to understand the weight of what happened. It is necessary to step back from the moment itself and look instead at the life it interrupted. Because the significance of the case involving Jill Maher does not come from any extraordinary circumstance surrounding her, but from the absence of it, from the fact that her life, as described within the available information, was stable, routine, and unremarkable in the most meaningful sense of the word, not unremarkable in value, but in the sense that it did not carry the kinds of warning signs or risk factors that might lead someone to anticipate danger. And this distinction is essential, because it shifts the focus away from any notion that the outcome was the result of a predictable trajectory, and instead places it within the realm of the unexpected, where ordinary circumstances give way to extraordinary consequences without clear cause or gradual progression. And within this context, her identity becomes central, not as a collection of dramatic details, but as a representation of normalcy itself. A person living within the everyday patterns of urban life in Melbourne, a city environment that, like many others, operates on a shared assumption of relative safety, particularly in spaces that are populated, familiar, and integrated into daily routines. And it is within these spaces that people develop a sense of trust, not necessarily a conscious trust, but one that is built through repetition, through the experience of moving through the same streets, the same routes, without incident. And over time, that repetition becomes its own form of reassurance, reinforcing the belief that these environments are predictable, that they function within understood boundaries, and that actions carried out within them, such as walking home, do not carry significant risk. And this belief is not unfounded. It is shaped by the reality that most of the time, these routines do unfold without disruption, that most nights end as expected, that most journeys are completed without incident. And it is precisely because of this consistency that the disruption, when it occurs, feels so profound, so disproportionate, because it breaks not only the immediate sequence of events, but the underlying expectation that such sequences are inherently safe. And in examining the context of Jill Maher, this expectation becomes a key element, because her actions on that night did not deviate from what would be considered normal behavior within that environment. She was not entering an unfamiliar or isolated space. She was not engaging in behavior that would typically be associated with elevated risk. She was simply moving from one point to another within a city, following a path that countless others would recognize. And this familiarity is what anchors the case in a broader social reality, because it highlights the extent to which safety is often assumed rather than actively assessed, the extent to which people rely on the patterns of their environment to inform their sense of security, and how those patterns, while generally reliable, are not absolute, and, as a result, the case does not stand apart as an isolated anomaly, but as a disruption of a shared experience, a moment that forces a reconsideration of what is typically taken for granted, and, in this way, the context surrounding Jill Marr becomes more than background information. It becomes a framework for understanding the broader implications of the case, because it illustrates how the ordinary can be interrupted, how the expected can be altered without warning, and how the environments people move through every day can, under certain circumstances, become a setting for events that do not align with the assumptions that define them. And this realization, while grounded in a specific case, extends beyond it, raising questions about how safety is perceived, how risk is understood, and how individuals navigate spaces that are both familiar and, at times, unpredictable. And it is within this intersection of routine and uncertainty that the case finds its deeper meaning, not in the details that set it apart, but in the ones that make it recognizable, the ones that reflect a reality shared by many, where the line between safety and vulnerability is not always visible, and where the absence of warning does not equate to the absence of risk. A sudden fracture in the ordinary, the moment itself, the point at which the routine of that evening gave way to something irreversible, is defined not by complexity, but by its abruptness, because in the case of Jill Marr, there was no prolonged sequence of escalating warning signs, no gradual shift in circumstances that might have allowed for recognition or avoidance, but instead a sudden encounter that transformed a familiar path into the setting of violence. And this transformation occurred within a space that, until that moment, had functioned as part of an ordinary urban environment, a space integrated into daily movement, where people walk, pass by one another, and continue on without incident. And it is precisely this context that makes the incident so difficult to reconcile, because it did not take place in isolation, nor in a setting defined by obvious danger, but within the framework of normal activity where the presence of others, the structure of the city, and the routine nature of movement all contribute to a sense of predictability, and yet, within that same framework, an individual approached her, and that approach, which in many situations would carry no consequence, became the turning point. The moment at which the assumptions of safety were no longer valid, and from that point forward, the sequence unfolded rapidly, without the kind of delay or hesitation that might allow for intervention or escape, because the nature of the act itself was direct, immediate, and unanticipated, leaving no meaningful opportunity for response. And this lack of opportunity is a defining characteristic, because it underscores the imbalance inherent in such encounters, where one person acts with intent and the other is placed in a position of sudden vulnerability, without preparation, without warning, and without the ability to alter the outcome once the event has begun. And in examining this moment, it is important to recognize that its impact extends beyond the physical act, because it represents a disruption of expectation at the most fundamental level. The expectation that movement through a familiar environment will remain within the bounds of normal experience. And when that expectation is broken so suddenly, it leaves behind not only the immediate consequences, but a broader sense of disorientation, a recognition that the structures people rely on for safety are not absolute, that they can be bypassed or undermined without prior indication. And this recognition is what gives the incident its lasting resonance, because it cannot be easily contained within a simple narrative of cause and effect. It resists reduction to a sequence that can be fully understood or anticipated, and instead exists as a moment where the ordinary and the extraordinary intersect, where a routine action, walking home, becomes the context for an event that defies the expectations associated with that action. And as a result, the incident involving Jill Maher is not only defined by what happened, but by how it happened, by the speed, the unpredictability, and the absence of warning that characterize it. And in that combination, it reveals a reality that is often difficult to confront, that not all dangers are preceded by signals, that not all risks can be identified in advance, and that in certain moments, the transition from safety to harm occurs so quickly that it cannot be meaningfully interrupted, leaving behind a sequence that is as brief as it is consequential, and a set of questions that extend far beyond the moment itself, into the broader understanding of how such events emerge within the spaces that are otherwise considered safe. From absence to identification in the immediate aftermath of the incident involving Jill Maher, what authorities were confronted with was not a fully formed narrative, but a gap, a disruption in expected movement that needed to be understood and reconstructed. And as with many cases that begin with a disappearance rather than a clearly defined scene, the initial stage of the investigation required a shift from certainty to inquiry, from known facts to the careful assembly of fragments that, on their own, did not yet form a complete picture, but held the potential to do so when viewed collectively. And in this case, the process began with the recognition that her actions on that evening had followed a predictable path up until a certain point, a point after which that predictability ceased. And it is precisely this point, the last known segment of routine, that became the focal area for investigative attention, because within it lay the transition from normalcy to uncertainty, from presence to absence. And in working within this framework, investigators did not begin with a definitive conclusion, but with a set of guiding questions centered on who had interacted with her, what had occurred within that critical window of time, and how the environment in which the incident took place could provide insight into those interactions. And unlike cases where there is a complete lack of traceable information, this investigation was not entirely devoid of direction. There were elements within the environment that allowed for a more structured approach, elements that could be examined, revisited, and connected over time. And this distinction proved significant because it enabled the investigation to move forward with a degree of momentum, rather than remaining static in the absence of evidence. And as attention narrowed to the immediate surroundings of the incident, the focus became increasingly specific, moving from broad uncertainty toward targeted inquiry. And it was within this narrowing process that a critical development emerged: the identification of a person who had approached her during that final segment of her journey. And this identification marked a turning point, because it transformed the nature of the investigation from one defined primarily by absence to one grounded in a specific interaction, an interaction that could be examined in greater detail, and from which further conclusions could be drawn. And as these conclusions began to take shape, the individual identified through this process became central to the case, not as a speculative figure, but as a subject of direct investigative focus. And this shift from uncertainty to identification represents one of the most important phases in any investigation, because it provides a foundation upon which subsequent actions can be built, including the gathering of additional information, the verification of existing data, and the progression toward formal charges. And in this instance, that progression led to the identification of Adrian Bailey as the primary suspect, a development that did not occur in isolation, but as the result of a cumulative process, one in which individual elements were examined, connected, and evaluated within the broader context of the case. And this cumulative nature is important to emphasize because it underscores the fact that investigations are not driven by singular moments of discovery, but by the gradual alignment of multiple pieces of information, each contributing to a clearer understanding of what occurred. And once this alignment reached a sufficient level of coherence, the investigation entered its next phase, the transition from identification to action, where the focus shifted from understanding the event to holding the responsible individual accountable for it. And in this way, the investigation into the case of Jill Marr illustrates not only the challenges inherent in reconstructing events that unfold quickly and without warning, but also the capacity of structured inquiry to move from uncertainty toward clarity, from absence toward presence, and from unanswered questions toward a defined path forward, even within the constraints of limited initial information. And it is within this progression that the case begins to take on a different form, no longer defined solely by what is unknown, but increasingly shaped by what can be established, what can be demonstrated, and what can ultimately be presented within the framework of the legal process. The structure of justice and its limits, once the investigation into the case of Jill Marr reached the point where a clear suspect had been identified and sufficient connections had been established, the process moved into a different phase, one governed not by the search for information, but by the formal evaluation of that information within a legal framework. And it is within this framework that events are no longer reconstructed solely for understanding, but for judgment, for the purpose of determining responsibility in a manner that is structured, regulated, and bound by established procedures. And in this instance, the individual identified through the investigative process, Adrian Bailey, was brought before the court, where the focus shifted from the question of what happened to the question of how what happened could be proven. And this distinction is essential, because the legal process does not operate on assumption or inference alone. It requires that conclusions be supported by evidence that meets a defined standard, a standard that is intended to ensure that judgments are not only decisive, but justified. And as the case progressed through this phase, the evidence that had been gathered during the investigation was presented, examined, and evaluated within this structured environment, where each element was considered in relation to the broader narrative that had been constructed, and where the objective was not merely to recount events, but to establish them in a way that could support a legal determination. And it is at this stage that the cumulative nature of the investigation becomes particularly significant, because the strength of the case does not rest on a single piece of evidence, but on the coherence of multiple elements that, when combined, form a consistent and demonstrable account. And in the case of Adrian Bailey, this coherence was sufficient to meet the required standard, leading to a conviction that formally assigned responsibility for the crime, and this conviction, in turn, led to the imposition of a life sentence, the most severe penalty available within the legal system, reflecting both the gravity of the offense and the perceived level of risk associated with the individual responsible. And in this outcome, there is a sense of finality, a conclusion that marks the end of the formal process, the point at which the system has fulfilled its role in identifying, prosecuting, and sentencing the perpetrator. And yet, this sense of finality must be understood within its proper context, because while the legal process provides resolution in terms of accountability, it does not and cannot fully address the broader implications of the case. It does not restore what was lost, nor does it eliminate the conditions that allowed the event to occur. And this introduces a distinction between legal resolution and experiential resolution, between the conclusion reached by the system and the ongoing impact experienced by those affected. And in recognizing this distinction, it becomes clear that the outcome, while definitive in one sense, remains partial in another, because it resolves the question of responsibility but leaves other questions about safety, about prevention, about the nature of such events, open for continued reflection. And it is within this duality that the significance of the trial and its outcome is fully understood, not as a complete closure, but as a necessary step within a larger process, one that moves from uncertainty to understanding, from understanding to judgment, and from judgment to reflection. And in this progression, the case of Jill Marr illustrates both the strengths and the limitations of the legal system, its ability to establish accountability and impose consequence, and its inability to fully resolve the deeper questions that arise from events that extend beyond the boundaries of law into the broader realities of human experience. When one case becomes a collective question in the aftermath of the case involving Jill Marr, what remains is not only the record of what occurred, nor solely the legal outcome that followed, but a broader and more enduring shift in perception, one that extends beyond the individuals directly involved and into the wider community. Because while the formal process reached its conclusion with the conviction of Adrian Bailey, the impact of the case did not end at that point. It continued, unfolding in conversations, in reflections, and in a growing awareness of the vulnerabilities that can exist within even the most familiar environments. And this continuation is what defines the true aftermath, not a single moment of closure, but an ongoing engagement with the questions that the case has raised, questions that do not have simple answers, and that cannot be fully addressed through legal resolution alone. And among these questions, one emerges with particular clarity: the question of safety, specifically the safety of women moving through public spaces, engaging in routine activities, and navigating environments that are generally perceived as secure. And it is this question that transforms the case from an individual event into a collective concern, because it touches on experiences that are widely shared, on actions that are carried out daily by countless individuals who, like Jill Marr, operate within the expectation that their environment will not present an immediate threat. And when that expectation is disrupted in such a visible and impactful way, it prompts a reassessment, not only of the specific circumstances of the case, but of the broader assumptions that underpin everyday behavior. And this reassessment does not necessarily lead to definitive conclusions, but it does lead to heightened awareness, to a recognition that safety is not absolute, that it can be influenced by factors that are not always visible or predictable, and that the absence of prior warning does not equate to the absence of risk. And within this recognition, there is both clarity and uncertainty. Clarity in the understanding that such events can occur, and uncertainty in determining how they can be prevented. Because the very nature of the incident, its suddenness, its lack of warning, complicates efforts to identify specific measures that could reliably eliminate the risk. And this complexity is what fuels the ongoing discussion, because it resists simple solutions. It challenges the idea that responsibility can be easily assigned or that safety can be fully guaranteed through individual or systemic action alone. And instead, it highlights the need for a more nuanced approach, one that acknowledges the limitations of both personal precaution and structural intervention, and that seeks to balance awareness with practicality, caution with the ability to maintain normalcy in daily life. And in this way, the case becomes a point of reference, not only for what happened, but for how society responds to what happened, how it interprets the implications, and how it integrates those interpretations into a broader understanding of risk and safety. And yet, even as these discussions evolve, the core of the case remains unchanged. The fact that an ordinary action carried out in an ordinary place led to an extraordinary outcome. And it is this contrast that continues to resonate. because it underscores the unpredictability that can exist within otherwise stable environments, and the difficulty of reconciling that unpredictability with the desire for security and control. And ultimately, the aftermath of the case of Jill Meagher is defined not by a single conclusion, but by a series of ongoing reflections. Reflections that extend beyond the specifics of the event and into the broader realities of how people live, move, and interact within shared spaces, and how they continue to do so in the presence of knowledge that, while necessary, does not always provide clear answers, but instead reinforces the importance of awareness, of vigilance, and of a continued commitment to understanding the conditions under which safety can be both maintained and, at times, unexpectedly disrupted. When familiar spaces conceal uncertainty in the continuing reflection on the case of Jill Meagher, one of the most persistent themes that emerges is the fragile nature of perceived safety, particularly within environments that are widely considered secure, because the incident did not occur in isolation, nor in a setting traditionally associated with heightened risk, but within an urban space, a space defined by activity, visibility, and the presence of others. And it is precisely this setting that complicates the understanding of what happened, because it challenges the assumption that familiarity and population density inherently provide protection, and instead reveals that these factors, while often associated with safety, are not absolute safeguards. And this realization introduces a subtle but significant shift in perspective, one that does not negate the value of familiar environments, but does call attention to their limitations, to the fact that the structures and patterns that create a sense of security can coexist with moments of unpredictability, moments that do not align with the expectations those structures are meant to reinforce. And in examining this dynamic, it becomes clear that safety, as it is commonly experienced, is not solely a function of objective conditions, but also of perception, of the way individuals interpret their surroundings based on past experience, social norms, and the absence of prior incidents. And over time, this perception becomes ingrained, forming a baseline expectation that guides behavior, that influences decisions such as walking alone at night, and that shapes the way people move through their environment without constant evaluation of risk. And in most cases, this expectation is validated, because the majority of such actions do not result in harm. And this consistency reinforces the belief that the environment is predictable, that it operates within understood parameters, and that deviations from those parameters are rare. And yet, it is precisely because of this consistency that the rare deviation carries such weight, because it disrupts not only the immediate situation, but the broader framework of understanding that supports it. And in the case of Jill Meagher, this disruption is particularly pronounced because it occurs without warning, without a visible breakdown in the environment itself, and without a preceding sequence that would allow for anticipation. And this absence of warning is what makes the illusion of safety so difficult to navigate, because it suggests that the indicators people rely on to assess risk are not always sufficient, that the absence of visible danger does not guarantee actual safety, and that the line between the two can, at times, be indistinct. And this indistinctness creates a tension between the need to maintain a sense of normalcy and the recognition that such normalcy is not immune to disruption. And managing this tension becomes a central challenge, both on an individual level and within the broader community, because it requires balancing awareness with practicality, acknowledging risk without allowing it to dominate everyday life. And in this balance, there is no simple resolution, no definitive approach that eliminates uncertainty entirely, but rather an ongoing process of adaptation, of reassessing how safety is understood and how it is integrated into daily behavior. And this process is shaped not only by the specifics of the case, but by its symbolic significance, by the way it represents a broader reality in which the familiar can, under certain circumstances, become unpredictable. And in reflecting on this, the case of Jilmar serves as a reminder that safety is not a static condition, but a dynamic one, influenced by a range of factors that are not always visible or controllable. And that understanding this dynamic is essential, not as a means of eliminating risk entirely, but as a way of engaging with it more consciously, more critically, and with a clearer awareness of the limits of what can be anticipated in environments that, while familiar, are never entirely free from uncertainty. How timing and circumstance shape outcomes in examining the case of Jilmar beyond its immediate facts. Another dimension begins to emerge, one that is less tangible than evidence or procedure, yet deeply influential in how events unfold. The role of chance, of timing, of the subtle alignment of circumstances that, while individually unremarkable, collectively determine the trajectory of a moment. And it is within this dimension that the case reveals an additional layer of complexity, because what occurred was not the result of a prolonged sequence of decisions or a series of identifiable risk factors, but of a brief intersection between two individuals within a shared space, an intersection that, under different circumstances, might not have occurred at all. And this realization does not alter the responsibility of the individual who committed the act, but it does highlight the contingent nature of the situation, the extent to which timing and location can influence outcomes in ways that are not always predictable or controllable. And in this context, the concept of chance becomes relevant, not as an explanation that replaces accountability, but as a factor that shapes the conditions under which accountability becomes necessary. Because the specific moment in which Jilmar was approached, the specific path she took, the specific environment in which she moved, all contributed to the formation of that encounter. And while each of these elements is ordinary in isolation, their convergence created a situation that deviated sharply from the expected pattern. And this convergence underscores the difficulty of reducing such events to a simple causal chain, because it involves variables that are not easily controlled or anticipated, variables that exist within the flow of everyday life and that only become significant in retrospect, once their alignment has already produced an outcome. And this retrospective recognition is what often shapes the way such cases are understood, because it introduces a sense of inevitability that was not present at the time, a perception that the event could have been foreseen or avoided if certain conditions had been different. And yet, within the framework of what was known in the moment, there was no clear indication that those conditions were unusual or that they would lead to a harmful outcome. And this gap between hindsight and real-time perception is a critical aspect of the case, because it highlights the limitations of predictive awareness, the fact that people operate based on the information available to them at the time, and that this information, while sufficient for navigating most situations, does not always account for the rare instances in which those situations change abruptly. And in acknowledging this, the role of chance becomes less about randomness in a general sense and more about the specific alignment of factors that, while individually benign, collectively produce a result that is anything but. And this understanding does not provide comfort, nor does it offer a clear strategy for prevention, but it does contribute to a more nuanced view of how such events occur, one that recognizes the interplay between individual action and situational context, between deliberate intent and incidental circumstance. And in this interplay, the case of Jilmar takes on a broader significance, not only as an instance of criminal behavior, but as an example of how outcomes can be shaped by factors that extend beyond direct control, and how the unpredictability inherent in these factors complicates efforts to fully understand or anticipate similar events in the future. And ultimately, this dimension of the case serves as a reminder that while systems can respond, investigate, and assign responsibility after the fact, the conditions that give rise to such events are not always fully within the scope of those systems to prevent in advance. And that within the ordinary flow of life, there exist moments where timing and circumstance intersect in ways that defy expectation, leaving behind outcomes that are as difficult to predict as they are to comprehend. When a private tragedy becomes a collective shock in the days and weeks following the case of Gilmar, the impact of what had occurred extended far beyond the immediate facts of the incident, moving outward into the broader community and transforming a single event into a shared point of reflection. And it is within this expansion that the case began to take on a different dimension, no longer confined to the specifics of one individual's experience, but becoming part of a larger social consciousness, where the reactions of others, those who had never met her, who were not directly connected to the circumstances, began to shape the narrative in ways that reflected collective concern, collective unease, and a collective attempt to understand how such an event could occur within a context that was widely perceived as safe. And this reaction was not driven solely by the severity of the crime, but by the familiarity of the circumstances. Because the actions that preceded the incident, going out, returning home, walking through a city, were not unusual. They were part of a shared experience that many people recognized in their own lives. And it is this recognition that creates a sense of proximity, a feeling that the boundary between what happened to someone else and what could happen to anyone is not as distinct as it might seem. And as this realization took hold, it began to influence the way the case was discussed, interpreted, and remembered, shifting the focus from the individual details to the broader implications. And in doing so, it generated a range of responses, from expressions of grief and sympathy to questions about safety, responsibility, and the nature of risk in public spaces. And these responses, while varied, were connected by a common thread: the need to reconcile the ordinary with the extraordinary, to understand how a routine action could lead to such a severe outcome. And this need is what drives public reaction in cases like this, because it reflects an underlying tension between expectation and reality, between the belief that certain environments are inherently safe and the evidence that, under certain conditions, they are not. And in navigating this tension, the community engages in a process of collective interpretation, where individual perspectives contribute to a broader understanding, even if that understanding remains incomplete. And within this process, certain themes begin to emerge, themes that persist beyond the immediate aftermath and continue to shape the conversation over time. And among these, the issue of women's safety becomes particularly prominent, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived experience that is brought into sharper focus by the case. And as discussions around this issue develop, they often extend beyond the specifics of the incident, encompassing broader questions about how safety is defined, how it is maintained, and how it can be improved. And while these discussions do not always lead to clear or unified conclusions, they do serve an important function. They create space for awareness, for dialogue, and for a more nuanced consideration of the factors that influence how people move through and interact with their environment. And in this way, the public reaction to the case of Gilmar becomes part of its lasting impact, not because it resolves the questions that the case raises, but because it keeps those questions present, ensuring that the event is not viewed in isolation, but as part of a larger context in which individual experiences intersect with collective understanding, and where the boundaries between personal safety and social responsibility are continually examined, redefined, and at times challenged. Individual action, social structures, and the limits of blame, as the case of Jill Maher, continued to resonate within public discourse. One of the most persistent and complex issues to emerge was the question of responsibility, not in the narrow legal sense, which had already been addressed through the conviction of Adrian Bailey, but in a broader, more diffuse sense that extended into social, cultural, and individual domains. And it is within this broader framework that the conversation becomes more difficult to navigate, because it involves multiple layers of interpretation, each attempting to make sense of how such an event could occur and what, if anything, could be done to prevent similar occurrences in the future. And at the most immediate level, responsibility is clear. It rests with the individual who committed the act, whose actions directly led to the outcome. And this clarity is essential because it anchors the case in a factual reality that cannot be obscured or reinterpreted. But beyond this point, the concept of responsibility begins to expand, encompassing questions that are less easily resolved, questions about the role of environment, the role of societal expectations, and the role of individual behavior within those contexts. And it is here that the conversation often becomes fragmented, because different perspectives emphasize different aspects of the situation, some focusing on the need for greater personal awareness and precaution, others on the need for systemic changes that enhance safety within public spaces, and still others on the importance of addressing the underlying conditions that contribute to such acts of violence. And while each of these perspectives offers a valid point of consideration, none of them, on their own, provides a complete answer, because the factors involved are interconnected, and isolating one does not eliminate the influence of the others. And this interconnectedness is what makes the issue of responsibility so complex, because it resists simplification. It does not lend itself to a single explanation or a single solution, and instead requires a more nuanced approach, one that acknowledges the multiple dimensions of the problem without attempting to reduce it to a singular cause. In the context of Jill Maher, this means recognizing that while the legal system can and did assign responsibility for the crime itself, the broader implications of the case extend into areas that are not governed by legal standard alone, areas where responsibility is shared, debated, and continuously redefined. And within this ongoing process, there is an inherent tension, a tension between the desire to identify clear points of accountability and the reality that not all contributing factors can be neatly categorized or addressed through direct action. And this tension is further complicated by the emotional weight of the case, which can influence how responsibility is perceived and discussed, sometimes leading to conclusions that are shaped more by reaction than by careful analysis. And it is for this reason that maintaining a balanced perspective is so important, because it ensures that the conversation remains grounded in the facts while still allowing for the exploration of broader questions. And in doing so, it preserves the integrity of the case as both a specific event and a catalyst for wider reflection. And ultimately, the question of responsibility in the case of Jill Maher does not yield a single, definitive answer beyond the legal determination, but instead opens up a space for ongoing consideration, a space in which individuals and communities alike are challenged to think critically about how safety is understood, how it is maintained, and how it can be strengthened in ways that are both realistic and effective, without losing sight of the fundamental truth that responsibility for the act itself remains with the individual who chose to commit it. When awareness cannot eliminate risk, as the discussion surrounding the case of Jill Maher continues to evolve, One of the most challenging realizations to confront is the inherent limitation of prevention itself. The understanding that while awareness, precaution, and systemic measures can reduce risk, they cannot entirely eliminate it. And this realization introduces a layer of complexity that is often difficult to reconcile, because it stands in contrast to a deeply rooted expectation that with enough information and enough vigilance, harm can be avoided, that there exists a set of actions or conditions that, if properly implemented, will ensure safety in all circumstances. And yet, the nature of the incident challenges this expectation, not by invalidating the value of preventive efforts, but by demonstrating that such efforts operate within boundaries. Boundaries defined by unpredictability, by the variability of human behavior, and by the fact that not all threats are visible or identifiable in advance. And in this context, prevention becomes less about guaranteeing safety and more about managing probability, about reducing the likelihood of harm without assuming that it can be reduced to zero. And this distinction is critical because it shifts the focus from absolute control to relative mitigation, from the idea of complete protection to the recognition of inherent vulnerability. And while this shift may appear unsettling, it is also more aligned with the realities of how such events occur, particularly in cases like that of Jill Marr, where the absence of warning signs and the suddenness of the act limit the effectiveness of measures that rely on anticipation. And in examining this limitation, it becomes clear that many of the strategies commonly associated with personal safety, remaining aware of one's surroundings, choosing well-lit routes, avoiding isolated areas, are based on the assumption that risk can be identified and navigated through observation. And while these strategies are valuable and often effective, they're not infallible, because they depend on the presence of indicators that may not always be present. And when those indicators are absent, as they were in this case, the ability to respond proactively is significantly reduced. And this does not suggest that such strategies should be abandoned, but rather that they should be understood within their proper scope, as tools that contribute to safety rather than guarantees that ensure it. And this understanding extends beyond individual behavior to include systemic efforts as well, such as urban planning, law enforcement presence, and public awareness campaigns, all of which play a role in shaping the conditions under which people move through their environment. And yet, like individual strategies, these efforts operate within constraints. They can influence patterns and reduce certain types of risk, but they cannot account for every possible scenario, nor can they fully control the actions of individuals who choose to act outside of those patterns. And it is within this intersection of effort and limitation that the concept of prevention must be situated, not as a definitive solution, but as an ongoing process, one that requires continuous evaluation, adaptation, and a willingness to acknowledge that even the most comprehensive measures cannot entirely remove the possibility of harm. And in reflecting on the case of Jill Marr, this acknowledgement becomes an essential part of understanding its broader implications, because it reinforces the importance of approaching safety with both awareness and realism, recognizing the value of preventive actions while also accepting the limits of what those actions can achieve. And in doing so, it encourages a more balanced perspective, one that does not rely on the illusion of complete control, but instead embraces a more nuanced view of risk, one that is informed by both the possibilities and the constraints that define how safety is experienced in the real world. When awareness cannot eliminate risk, as the discussion surrounding the case of Jill Marr continues to evolve, one of the most challenging realizations to confront is the inherent limitation of prevention itself. The understanding that while awareness, precaution, and systemic measures can reduce risk, they cannot entirely eliminate it. And this realization introduces a layer of complexity that is often difficult to reconcile, because it stands in contrast to a deeply rooted expectation that with enough information and enough vigilance, harm can be avoided, that there exists a set of actions or conditions that, if properly implemented, will ensure safety in all circumstances. And yet, the nature of the incident challenges this expectation, not by invalidating the value of preventive efforts, but by demonstrating that such efforts operate within boundaries. Boundaries defined by unpredictability, by the variability of human behavior, and by the fact that not all threats are visible or identifiable in advance. And in this context, prevention becomes less about guaranteeing safety and more about managing probability, about reducing the likelihood of harm without assuming that it can be reduced to zero. And this distinction is critical because it shifts the focus from absolute control to relative mitigation, from the idea of complete protection to the recognition of inherent vulnerability. And while this shift may appear unsettling, it is also more aligned with the realities of how such events occur, particularly in cases like that of Jill Marr, where the absence of warning signs and the suddenness of the act limit the effectiveness of measures that rely on anticipation. And in examining this limitation, it becomes clear that many of the strategies commonly associated with personal safety, remaining aware of one's surroundings, choosing well-lit routes, avoiding isolated areas, are based on the assumption that risk can be identified and navigated through observation. And while these strategies are valuable and often effective, they're not infallible, because they depend on the presence of indicators that may not always be present. And when those indicators are absent, as they were in this case, the ability to respond proactively is significantly reduced. And this does not suggest that such strategies should be abandoned, but rather that they should be understood within their proper scope, as tools that contribute to safety rather than guarantees that ensure it. And this understanding extends beyond individual behavior to include systemic efforts as well, such as urban planning, law enforcement presence, and public awareness campaigns, all of which play a role in shaping the conditions under which people move through their environment. And yet, like individual strategies, these efforts operate within constraints. They can influence patterns and reduce certain types of risk, but they cannot account for every possible scenario, nor can they fully control the actions of individuals who choose to act outside of those patterns. And it is within this intersection of effort and limitation that the concept of prevention must be situated, not as a definitive solution, but as an ongoing process, one that requires continuous evaluation, adaptation, and a willingness to acknowledge that even the most comprehensive measures cannot entirely remove the possibility of harm. And in reflecting on the case of Jill Marr, this acknowledgement becomes an essential part of understanding its broader implications, because it reinforces the importance of approaching safety with both awareness and realism, recognizing the value of preventive actions while also accepting the limits of what those actions can achieve. And in doing so, it encourages a more balanced perspective, one that does not rely on the illusion of complete control, but instead embraces a more nuanced view of risk, one that is informed by both the possibilities and the constraints that define how safety is experienced in the real world. How the story extends beyond the event, as the case of Jill Marr moved beyond the immediate facts and into the public sphere. It entered a phase where the event itself was no longer the only focus, but rather how that event was interpreted, communicated, and remembered over time. Because once a case becomes widely known, it transforms from a sequence of actions into a narrative. And that narrative carries its own influence, shaping perception in ways that extend far beyond the original moment. And in this transformation, the role of media and public discourse becomes central, not in altering the facts, but in selecting which aspects of those facts are emphasized, how they are framed, and how they are connected to broader social concerns. And in the case of Jill Maher, the narrative that developed was built around a powerful contrast. The contrast between normal life and sudden violence, between routine behavior and irreversible consequence. And this contrast resonated deeply because it was immediately recognizable. It did not require specialized knowledge to understand, and it reflected a situation that many people could imagine themselves in. And because of this, the case did not remain distant or abstract. It became immediate, personal, and emotionally accessible. And this accessibility is what allows a case to take hold within public consciousness, to move beyond being a singular event and become a reference point for broader discussions about safety, vulnerability, and risk. And as this narrative solidified, it began to influence not only how this case was understood, but how similar cases were interpreted, creating a framework through which new events could be compared and contextualized. And in this way, the story of Jill Maher extended beyond its own boundaries, contributing to a larger pattern of meaning that shaped public awareness. And yet, this process of narrative construction also introduces a subtle tension, because narratives, by their nature, simplify. They organize complex realities into forms that are easier to process. And while this simplification is necessary for communication, it can also lead to a narrowing of perspective, where certain details are highlighted while others are minimized, and where the complexity of individual circumstances is sometimes reduced to fit a more coherent storyline. And this does not mean that the narrative is inaccurate, but rather that it is selective, that it reflects choices about emphasis and interpretation. And these choices influence how the case is remembered, how it is discussed, and how it informs future thinking. And in recognizing this, it becomes important to approach such narratives with a degree of awareness, to understand that they are both informative and interpretive, that they convey facts while also shaping the meaning of those facts. And in doing so, they play a dual role. They preserve the memory of what happened, and they influence how that memory is integrated into the broader social context. And ultimately, the narrative surrounding the case of Jill Maher illustrates how a single event can extend far beyond its original moment, becoming part of a continuing conversation about safety, behavior, and the unpredictable nature of human interaction, and how the way that event is told becomes almost as significant as the event itself, because it determines how it is understood, how it is felt, and how it continues to resonate over time. How an individual life becomes a lasting presence over time. As the immediacy of the case begins to recede and the structured phases of investigation and trial are concluded, what remains is not only the record of what happened, but the enduring presence of memory. And in the case of Jill Maher, this memory does not exist as a static recollection, but as an evolving form of legacy, shaped by how the event is remembered, discussed, and integrated into the broader fabric of community awareness. And it is within this transition from event to memory that the meaning of the case takes on a different dimension, one that is less focused on the sequence of actions and more on the lasting imprint those actions leave behind. Because memory, unlike immediate reaction, is not defined by urgency, but by persistence, by the way certain events continue to occupy space in collective consciousness long after their occurrence. And this persistence is influenced by several factors, including the nature of the event itself, the degree to which it resonates with shared experience, and the way it has been communicated and understood over time. And in this instance, the memory of Jill Maher is closely tied to the sense of normalcy that preceded the incident. to the recognition that her life, as described, reflected a pattern that many others identify with. And it is this identification that sustains the memory, that prevents it from fading into abstraction, because it remains connected to ongoing behavior, to everyday actions that continue to mirror the circumstances in which the event occurred. And as a result, the legacy of the case is not confined to historical record. It is actively maintained through the continued relevance of its context, through the way it informs conversations about safety, awareness, and the unpredictability of certain situations. And in this sense, legacy becomes both a form of remembrance and a form of influence, a way of preserving the significance of the individual while also allowing that significance to contribute to a broader understanding. And yet, this process must be approached with care, because there is a delicate balance between remembering an individual as a person and remembering them as part of a larger narrative. And maintaining that balance is essential to ensuring that the legacy does not become impersonal, that it does not reduce a life to a symbol alone, but continues to acknowledge the individuality that existed before the event, and in doing so, it reinforces the importance of empathy, of viewing the case not only through the lens of analysis or discussion, but through an awareness of its human dimension. And this awareness shapes how the memory is carried forward, how it is shared, and how it is respected. And ultimately, the legacy of Jill Maurer is defined not only by what happened, but by how it continues to be held within collective understanding, as a reminder of both the fragility of ordinary moments and the enduring impact that those moments can have when they are unexpectedly altered. And in this way, memory becomes more than recollection. It becomes a connection between past and present, between individual experience and shared awareness, and between the event itself and the ongoing reflections it inspires. When tragedy influences collective thinking as time moves forward from the case of Jill Maurer, its impact begins to manifest not only in memory, but in subtle shifts within social awareness, in the way individuals and communities reconsider their assumptions about safety, behavior, and shared responsibility. And it is within this gradual transformation that the broader significance of the case becomes evident. Because while a single ghatna cannot, on its own, redefine societal structures, it can contribute to an ongoing process of reflection that, over time, influences how those structures are perceived and discussed. And in this sense, the case acts as a catalyst, not by providing definitive answers, but by prompting questions that persist beyond the immediate context. Questions about how public spaces are experienced, how risk is understood, and how awareness can be translated into meaningful change without undermining the ability to live freely within those spaces. And these questions do not lead to uniform conclusions, but they do encourage a more engaged perspective, one in which safety is not taken for granted, but actively considered, and in which the balance between individual behavior and collective responsibility is continually examined. And this examination often takes place across multiple levels, from personal reflection to broader public discussion. And while the outcomes of these discussions may vary, their existence is itself significant, because it indicates a willingness to engage with the complexities of the issue rather than ignoring them. In the context of Jill Maurer, this engagement is closely tied to the recognition that the circumstances of the case are not isolated, that they reflect patterns and possibilities that extend beyond a single ghatna, and that addressing these patterns requires both awareness and adaptation. And yet, this process is inherently gradual. It does not produce immediate or universally accepted solutions, but instead unfolds over time, influenced by new information, changing perspectives, and the ongoing interplay between experience and understanding. And within this unfolding, The case contributes to a broader shift in how safety is conceptualized, moving from a static assumption to a dynamic consideration, one that acknowledges both the progress that has been made and the limitations that remain. And in doing so, it encourages a more realistic approach, one that does not rely on the expectation of complete security, but seeks to enhance awareness and resilience within the existing framework of everyday life. And ultimately, the influence of the case lies not in a single outcome or policy, but in its ability to sustain attention, to keep certain questions present within collective thinking, and to serve as a reference point for ongoing efforts to understand and navigate the complexities of safety in a way that is both informed and balanced. And in this way, the legacy of Jill Maher continues to evolve, not as a fixed conclusion, but as part of a continuing dialogue that shapes how individuals and communities interpret and respond to the realities of their environment. The unanswered question that remains even after the legal resolution, the public discussion, and the gradual integration of the case into collective memory. The story of Jill Maher does not conclude in a way that feels complete, because while many aspects of the case have been addressed, responsibility has been established, the sequence of events has been understood, and the broader implications have been explored, there remains an underlying question that resists final resolution. A question that exists not within the details of the case, but within its meaning. And that question is both simple and profound. How can something so ordinary lead to something so irreversible? And it is this question that continues to give the case its enduring significance, because it touches on a fundamental tension within human experience. The tension between predictability and uncertainty, between the structures that create a sense of order and the moments that disrupt that order without warning. And in examining this tension, it becomes clear that the case is not only about a specific ghatna, but about the broader reality in which such ghatnae occur. A reality in which safety is never absolute, in which risk cannot be entirely eliminated, and in which the boundaries between normality and danger are not always visible in advance. And this realization does not negate the value of awareness or precaution, but it does place them within a more realistic context, one that acknowledges both their importance and their limitations, and in doing so, it shifts the focus from seeking certainty to developing understanding, from attempting to control every possible outcome to recognizing the inherent unpredictability that exists within everyday life. And yet, this understanding does not diminish the impact of what happened. It does not make the loss any less significant, nor does it reduce the importance of the individual at the center of the case. Because beyond all analysis and reflection, the story remains grounded in the life of Jill Maher, a life that was part of the ordinary flow of experience, a life that followed patterns shared by many, and a life that was altered in a way that continues to resonate. And it is this resonance that ensures the case is not forgotten, that it continues to be referenced, reconsidered, and reflected upon, not only as an example of a particular ghatna, but as a reminder of the broader questions it raises, questions that do not have simple answers, but that remain relevant precisely because of their complexity. And in this sense, the conclusion of the case is not defined by closure, but by continuation, by the ongoing presence of those questions within individual and collective thought, and by the way they influence how people understand their environment, their behavior, and the nature of safety itself. And ultimately, the case of Jill Maher leaves behind more than a record of what occurred. It leaves behind a framework for reflection, a way of thinking about the relationship between ordinary life and unexpected ghatna, and a reminder that even in the most familiar circumstances, there exists a degree of uncertainty that cannot be entirely resolved, only acknowledged. understood, and carried forward as part of the broader human experience. Living with what cannot be fully resolved as the case of Jill Maher settles into the long arc of reflection. Beyond the immediate shock, beyond the structured conclusions of investigation and trial, what remains is a quieter, more internal process, a reckoning that does not take place in courtrooms or headlines, but within the minds of those who continue to move through the same kinds of spaces, engage in the same kinds of routines, and carry with them the awareness that something irreversible once occurred under circumstances that felt entirely ordinary. And it is within this awareness that the final dimension of the case emerges, not as a new set of facts, but as a shift in perception, a subtle but lasting change in how everyday life is experienced, because even as routines continue, even as streets remain the same and actions remain familiar, there is now an added layer of understanding, an acknowledgement that the predictability of those routines is not absolute, that it exists within limits that are not always visible. And this acknowledgement does not necessarily lead to fear, nor does it require constant vigilance, but it does introduce a form of consciousness, a recognition that safety is something that is navigated rather than guaranteed. And in this sense, the legacy of Jill Maher becomes part of a broader human experience, one that involves balancing awareness with the need to live freely, to continue engaging with the world without allowing uncertainty to define every action. And this balance is not fixed. It varies from person to person, from moment to moment, influenced by individual perspective, by personal experience, and by the way each person interprets the meaning of the case within their own life. And for some, it may result in changes to routine, in small adjustments that reflect a desire for greater control, while for others, it may exist more as an underlying awareness, something that informs perception without significantly altering behavior. And neither response is inherently right or wrong, because both are attempts to reconcile the same fundamental reality that the world, while often predictable, is not entirely so, and that within its patterns there exist moments that cannot be fully anticipated or prevented. And in coming to terms with this reality, there is a form of acceptance, not of the Ghutna itself, but of the limitations of certainty, the understanding that not all risks can be eliminated, and that living with this understanding is part of the human condition. And yet, even within this acceptance, there remains a sense of continuity, a recognition that life does not stop, that routines persist, that people continue to move, to connect, and to engage with their environment in ways that reflect both their awareness of risk and their resilience in the face of it. And it is within this continuity that the final impact of the case can be seen, not as a disruption that permanently alters the structure of daily life, but as a presence that coexists with it, shaping perspective without completely redefining it. And in this way, the story of Jill Maher does not end with a definitive conclusion, but continues as part of an ongoing dialogue between experience and understanding, between what is known and what remains uncertain, and between the desire for safety and the reality of a world that cannot be fully controlled. And it is within this dialogue that the case finds its lasting place, not only as an event to be remembered, but as a reminder of the complexities that underlie even the most ordinary moments of human life. How routine continues in the shadow of awareness in the long stretch of time that follows the case of Jill Maher. What becomes most apparent is not a dramatic transformation of daily life, but rather its continuation, the persistence of routine, of movement, of ordinary actions that resume despite the knowledge of what has occurred. And it is within this continuation that the true complexity of the aftermath is revealed. Because life does not pause indefinitely in response to a single Ghutna, no matter how impactful. Instead, it adapts. It absorbs the awareness generated by that event and integrates it into an ongoing pattern of behavior. And this integration is often subtle, not always visible in overt changes, but present in the way individuals think about their surroundings, in the way they interpret certain situations, and in the quiet adjustments they may or may not choose to make. And in this sense, the aftermath is not defined by a clear before and after divide, but by a gradual blending of past experience with present action, where the memory of the case exists alongside the necessity of continuing forward. And this coexistence is not without tension, because it involves holding two seemingly opposing realities at once: the understanding that routine is generally safe, and the recognition that it is not entirely free from risk. And navigating this tension requires a kind of balance, one that allows individuals to remain aware without becoming immobilized, to acknowledge uncertainty without allowing it to dominate their perception of the world. And this balance is not achieved in a single moment, but developed over time, through repeated engagement with the same environments, through the reaffirmation of normalcy in the absence of incident, and through the gradual reestablishment of trust in the patterns that define everyday life. And yet, even as this trust is rebuilt, it is not identical to what it was before. It is informed by knowledge, by the understanding that while the likelihood of such events may be low, their possibility cannot be entirely dismissed. And it is this informed trust that characterizes the everyday after, a state in which individuals continue to participate in the routines that shape their lives, but do so with a deeper awareness of the conditions under which those routines unfold. And in reflecting on this, the case of Jill Maher becomes part of a larger narrative about resilience, not in the sense of overcoming or forgetting, but in the ability to continue, to maintain a connection to normal life while carrying with them the understanding that normal life is not without its complexities. And this form of resilience is not dramatic or easily defined. It exists in the quiet decisions, in the choice to walk, to move, to engage with the world despite its uncertainties. And in this way, the legacy of the case is not only found in the questions it raises or the discussions it generates, but in the way it becomes woven into the fabric of everyday experience, influencing how that experience is perceived without entirely redefining it. And ultimately, the everyday after is a reflection of both continuity and change, of routines that persist and awareness that evolves. And in this intersection, the impact of Jill Maher continues to exist, not as a constant disruption, but as a presence that shapes understanding while allowing life to move forward. Holding on to routine while knowing its limits in the extended reflection on the case of Jill Maher. What gradually becomes clearer is not only the persistence of everyday life, but the fragility that underlies it, a fragility that is not always visible, yet becomes impossible to ignore once it has been revealed, because normalcy, as it is experienced day to day, is often built on repetition and expectation, on the idea that what has happened before will continue to happen in the same way. And for the most part, this assumption holds true. It allows individuals to move through their environment without constant uncertainty, to engage in routine actions without needing to question every step. And it is this reliability that makes normal life sustainable, that allows people to function, to connect, and to operate within a shared understanding of safety. And yet, the case disrupts this understanding, not by eliminating it entirely, but by exposing its limits, by showing that while normalcy is common, it is not guaranteed, and that within its structure there exist moments where that structure can break without warning. And this realization introduces a subtle but enduring tension. A tension between the desire to maintain a sense of normal life and the awareness that such life is not entirely predictable. And navigating this tension requires a kind of adjustment, not necessarily in outward behavior, but an internal perception, in the way individuals interpret their surroundings and assess their sense of security. And this adjustment is often gradual, unfolding over time as the initial impact of the case transitions into a more stable form of understanding. And within this understanding, there is an acceptance of complexity, a recognition that safety is not a fixed state, but a condition that exists within a range of possibilities, influenced by both visible and invisible factors. And this recognition does not negate the value of routine, nor does it diminish the importance of continuing with daily life. But it does add a layer of awareness that was not previously present, a layer that acknowledges both the strength and the vulnerability of ordinary circumstances. And in this way, the legacy of Jill Maher becomes intertwined with the concept of fragile normalcy, a state in which life continues as before, yet is understood differently, where actions remain the same, but the context in which they are interpreted has shifted. And this shift, while subtle, is significant because it reflects a deeper engagement with reality, one that does not rely solely on assumption, but incorporates the knowledge that even the most familiar patterns can, under certain conditions, be disrupted. And yet, despite this knowledge, life does not retreat into constant caution. It moves forward, maintaining its rhythms while carrying with it the understanding of their limits. And it is within this balance, between continuation and awareness, between stability and uncertainty, that the enduring impact of the case can be found, not as a force that halts normal life, but as one that reshapes how that life is perceived, making it at once more grounded and more complex, and ultimately, this fragile normalcy becomes a defining feature of the aftermath, a way of living that acknowledges both the reliability of routine and the reality that such reliability is never absolute.